All right, so I want to do a compression test on this and a cylinder leak down test and take a look at the spark plugs, but before I can pull them out, we've got to get the shop vac in here and get rid of all this crap so it doesn't fall into the combustion chamber. All right, so here's a tip. Whenever you don't get the spark plug wrench directly on it and it's off at an angle, don't just put your weight on it because you'll snap the top of the plug off like I did here. All right, got the spark plugs out, including the one I broke. Just looking at cylinder number 1. Doesn't look too bad. Carbon fouling. A lot of rust here on the bottom, which makes me think that water has been pooling where in those little wells where the spark plugs are. Number 2 looks like it's oil fouled. And there's a lot of oil on that. And again, same rust that we see. Of course, number 3, other than being broken, it actually, I mean, there's a little bit of corrosion here, but not too bad. A little less carbon fouling than the other cylinders. Number 4, and I got a lot of rust on that side. Again, a little bit of oil, a little bit of carbon fouling. Number 5, same story. Got a lot of debris in the threads. And I don't know if that was from taking it out or it just happened to be in there. But this one, that was almost rusted into the well. And look how far down that rust goes on the threads. And this one, I mean, I don't even know if that one of these cylinders is not firing. So number 6 is definitely suspect here. All right, I've got the compression gauge hooked up to number 1 cylinder, and this has electronic ignition module in it, which I've disconnected. So whenever I put the battery cable back on and hit the starter, there's no chance of anything firing. I mean, we do have a little bit of gas here, but I don't think that would cause any problem. So I'm going to hook the starter up and give it a few bumps and see what we see on a gauge. Well, there's your problem. Cylinder number 2, pretty much no compression at all. Number 1 had 90. Go ahead and test the rest of them. But number 2, 0. So that was definitely the one that wasn't firing. All right, so we have another anomaly. Cylinders 1, 3, 5, and 4 all tested 90. 2 had nothing, and 6 has about 110. So we need to get that valve cover off and see what's going on with the valves and get the Boroscope down in there and see if we can see carbon buildup or something that would cause that higher compression. So I have the valve cover off. Those valve cover screws were finger tight. Yeah, that's not good. Oh, look at that. That should not be happening. Oh, wow. There's your problem. Look at that. Normally push rods are supposed to stay... Is that bent? Wow, okay. Well, that sucks. Let's see if we can get a look at the rest of these back here. That one's a little loose. Oh, wow. Yeah, this is in rougher shape than I thought. All right, I have the blower motor removed, and now there's plenty of access to that side of the engine. I put the valve cover back on just temporarily because I didn't want dirt or crap like that getting into where the valves are and getting into the engine. So on taking this out, just for future reference, I took a bolt out here I shouldn't have. This one was behind the blower, which took a lot to get to. I got it loosened up, but I didn't get it out. Then I realized that with this blower, these protrusions here go inside, so you have to actually take it out from underneath the dash. We can take this valve cover back off, which is real easy to do whenever there's not crap in the way. And look at some of this back here. Yeah, that should definitely not happen. That one's loose. Of course, that one's missing the push rod now. This one, if you remember, had the cylinder that had a lot of compression in it, so I wonder if that's even opening at all. I'll have to crank that a little bit and see what happens, but I'm guessing this valve here, which is an intake valve, is probably frozen open since we had bad compression on this, or no compression. And that explains the what everybody was referring to as spitting back through the carburetor. So this valve is actually frozen open a little bit. Once the engine is running, there's sufficient vacuum in the manifold that it's not going to matter. But, you know, during initial cranking and maybe even whenever it's running low RPM, that cylinder fires and there's a sufficient fuel mixture in there. The expanding gases, since it's not since it has a way to go back through the intake manifold, it could definitely, and has, fired back up through the carburetor, and if there's any gas there, it'll ignite, start a fire. So this has probably been this way for a long time. One thing I've noticed is that these heads are interchangeable. What kind of clued me into that is this is the water, the coolant crossover here, and it bolts in right here. Well, if this head is spun around, you see this empty plate over here. At first I thought maybe something was missing, maybe there was some emissions component or something somebody took off, but yeah, these can both be flipped around because this one has the same cap over here. So if this head were installed over there, it would be connecting to this coolant passage. I got the Boroscope in cylinder number 2 and was looking at the valves, and at first I thought that the intake valve was stuck open, and you know, I was looking at one valve seemed to be completely seated and another wasn't seated all the way. It was open enough to have a compression leak. So of course, looking at that thing, it's real difficult to tell exactly what you're looking at. So I bumped the starter a bit and got the exhaust valve to open and looked at it there and got an idea, okay, this is the valve that's open now. Ran it through again, trying not to crush the end of the camera in the cylinder. I'm thinking we actually have a stuck open, or rather an exhaust valve that is not seating all the way. So I'm going to put leak down tester on this cylinder and put some air in it once I think that it should be at TDC. I guess it really doesn't matter since the intake valve is shut, and I believe it's shut all the way, but we will put some air in the cylinder and see where it leaks out. I have a suspicion that the cylinder has two problems. Bent push rod on the intake, well actually not only bent push rod, but the push rod was actually completely not even engaging with the rocker arm. So intake valve wasn't working at all, and the exhaust valve doesn't look like it's seating, so I'll confirm that. I've got the leak down tester hooked up, pressurized to, on my gauge on my compressor said 60, but I only have 30 going to this, and I can hear it. And oh, it's coolant hose. It doesn't sound like it's coming out of the intake. Now that is part of the crankcase ventilation. It might be coming out of that, escaping past the rings, which might be a whole other issue. But I think it's coming out of the exhaust. Let's get under there and listen to the exhaust pipe. Well, I don't hear anything coming out of that. So I just realized that I have all of the other plugs out, so of course we won't be able to tell since the air will just escape through whatever manifolds out to the next cylinder. So let me get the plugs back in and we'll check again. So all the plugs are now reinstalled. So let's crank this thing up and see if we can find that air link. Maybe. Doesn't seem to be coming from Well, I was going to say it doesn't seem to be coming from the throat of the carburetor, but so it sounds like it's coming from that hole right there. And that may be because it's slipping past the, well, I was going to say maybe slipping past the valve guide, but the valve would have to be open. If the valve is closed, of course that may be just slipping past the rings. Maybe it has a broken ring. Alright, so I redid the compression test, and now I'm getting about 70, which before we got 0. So I'm wondering exactly what could have changed. And it still sounds like that I have leaked down, really maybe past the cylinder rings, but I hit the starter and ended up with back pressure on the leak down test, redid the compression test, got 70. I'm rather perplexed at this point. As we can see, that valve definitely is not seating. On the right hand side there, those two surfaces should closely match. This is the actual valve. This is the head. There shouldn't be this lip here. And actually at the very bottom of this, where it kind of changes direction there, is the actual mating surface to the valve seat. So every time that valve goes up and down, it rotates just a slight bit. So it's anyone's guess each time it lands whether or not it has a seal or not, and probably not a very good one. That's how come we got no compression on that yesterday, but testing it just now, we got about 70, because that happened to close in such a way to mostly seal it, but it's still not in its seat. So we're probably going to have to remove the head and at least give that side a valve job. We've got one stuck valve, which probably is why the push rod vent stuck intake valve, and then this is the exhaust valve that isn't seating properly. So double whammy on cylinder number 2. So I was reading in the service manual, and here it says cylinder compression should be 125 psi. And the only one that was close to that was number 6, that got about 120 psi. Of course, nothing in 2, and the rest of them had 90 psi. So we need to figure out while we're getting a compression drop off. So I'm going to redo the test, but this time put some a little bit of Marvel mystery oil in each one of the cylinders, and then rerun the compression test and see if we can get it closer to 125. If we can, then that means the problem is with the piston rings, and they may be wore or broken or have other problems. If that doesn't help it, then we may have valve issues on both sides. So with some Marvel mystery oil in the cylinders, we got about a 30 psi boost. It went from 90 on most of them to 120. With, of course, the exceptions being number 2, which the exhaust valve isn't sealing, and that one actually ended up getting about 10 psi from 0. And then number 6 got all the way up to 140 psi, but that is the backmost cylinder on here, which is exactly where the oil pump is. So perhaps it's not as worn as some of these others. All right, I have the other valve cover off. So let's see how loose these are. It's kind of loose. Okay, that one's engaged. That one feels good. That one's kind of loose. That one feels good. That one's engaged. Let's see. Trying to get that back one to be loose. Looks like that should do it. A little loose, not near as bad as the one on the other side. Yeah, this is a lot better than the other side. So I've been running a cylinder leak down test on all cylinders, and all of them get something like this. Here we are up to 60 psi, and it's basically just all going right past the rings. I thought it could be going past the valves, but I listened on the carburetor, I listened on the tailpipe. I could not hear that hissing until I listened down here. Now the microphone on the camera is right next to my mouth, so you won't be able to hear that, but the hissing is coming out of that pipe. So what is that pipe? This is actually what used to be called a blow-by tube. It has maybe some steel wool or some kind of, quote, filter element in that top portion, but it basically vents the crankcase straight to the atmosphere. This was done in the 40s and 50s until they came up with positive crankcase ventilation, which this truck is supposed to have. Underneath this valve cover, there is this valve here, and that goes directly in behind the intake valve on the cylinder head. And what that does is it allows blow-by gases that are in here in the lubrication tract to be sucked into the combustion chamber where they're burned, and then to replace that air, the intake, the air comes through that tube, which is supposed to have an inlet on it. So instead of just blow by going straight out to the road, it makes its way into the combustion chamber. But the other problem is both these oil filler caps also have air intakes, so all it's doing on this side is just sucking air straight out of there, not sucking it throughout the rest of the engine. So that's going to have to be fixed. Every cylinder I tested, just the air was going completely past the piston rings. I tried to squirt a little oil in there, see if that made any difference. It didn't. Curiously, on number 5, whenever I first tested the leak down, that actually worked. I don't know if a compression ring lined up the right way or what, but we had good compression there for a second. So either I'm completely missing something, or these rings and cylinders are so wore out that, you know, it gets compression on every third or fourth stroke. So it's amazing this thing is running at all. Well, after all those compression tests, it's pretty obvious that we've got some serious leakage past the piston rings. To do it right on this, we'd need to basically do a total engine rebuild, take the heads off, drop the pan. I think this can be rebuilt in the truck, but I need it for other things, and we're just going to have to make do with the, whatever's leaking past the piston rings. And I'm thinking that once this thing really gets going, maybe those rings will seal up. But anyway, we still need to get cylinder number 2 working, and it has this valve here, this intake valve that's stuck so bad that it bent the push rod. I do have new push rods now, so rather than bend those, I'm going to try and free this intake valve. I'm going to start with maybe a little concussive therapy. Before I try that, I did use this Seafoam Deep Creep and spray all in it, and I've been letting it soak for a few days. So let me beat on this with a hammer, since that always fixes things, and if that doesn't work, we'll go to prying on it, and if we can get this valve unstuck, then maybe I can get the rest of this truck going and we can deal with the rings later. Well, amazingly, with a few whacks of the sledgehammer and a little bit of prying action, this has come loose and it seems to be working fine. So I'm going to get the new push rod in there and we'll crank it over and see if it works. So I've got the push rod installed and somewhat adjusted by ear. And we can see this works just fine. So let me get a compression gauge on this. I reran the compression test and we're only getting about 60. I think we got 90 on the others, and I think 60 is about what we got before on this cylinder. So, I mean, of course, we know the rings are probably bad, and that exhaust valve probably isn't seating right, but at least this thing has a chance of firing on this cylinder now. I'm going to go ahead and try to crank it, and we'll see what happens. All right, well, the good news is it sounds like it's actually firing on all 6 cylinders instead of just 5. So I think that problem has been resolved. But in listening to this through the course of putting this video together, man, I can really hear those tapping sounds, and almost sounds like maybe a knock or a rod knock or something. Hopefully not, but we'll have to cross that bridge when we get to it. But I think I'm going to end the video here. Most of this was filmed a few months ago, so there's other work that I've done that I've filmed. I'm going to put out videos for that. I think the next one I do on the truck will kind of take off where we left off here, and get the valves adjusted, get new plugs and wires in it, get the timing set up where it's supposed to be, and then, really see how it sounds. But anyway, thanks for watching, and subscribe if you haven't already. I've really been backlogged on this video editing. I've got several more I'm going to put out, so please like and subscribe.